Namaste and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our continuing series, Evenings with Sraddhalu. Today we continue part 11 on the same theme with a special focus on the role of such experiences in the context of the integral yoga. And we are happy to announce that today we complete 10 years since this YouTube channel was created. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste. It's a special occasion. 10 years is a long time, and I hope it will be an opportunity to continue to be of service in a way that is helpful for the sadhana of all.
We also hope more and more years to come from now. As usually, you may post questions on this theme in the chat box during our conversation in the YouTube channel, or you may send your questions beforehand at our email ID, integralstudies.in@gmail.com. And we will start with one question, or?
Yes. So first, just before we go to the question, most of you will remember that we had planned originally for today to be reserved for Geminus to join us with our questions regarding out-of-body experiences, which he would share from his experience. And he is the only person I know who has the necessary depth and richness of experience of this kind, but with the background of the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo. So it is going to be something very valuable for the integral yoga community itself. But unfortunately today he is not able to come on a video call because he's still recovering from an accident that he had a few months ago. And there are certain days when he does not feel up to the task of coming on the video. But as soon as he is able to, he will join us. And for that purpose, we will perhaps have one or two more sessions on this topic. And then whether he comes online within that time or not, we will keep the last session of this theme for whenever he comes online. But it will happen in the coming weeks whenever is possible for him. So many questions which have come from all of you, especially in relation to the integral yoga, I have kept on hold just for him because he would be, as far as I am aware, the most authentic source today. There are other questions which are perhaps of a kind which I can address using the references of the mother in Sri Aurobindo's writings, as well as what is well known already. I have a collection of about 25 passages from Sri Aurobindo and the mother, which deal with aspects of exteriorization or out-of-body experiences. Some are in passing, some are quite deep and profound and rich in their implications. So what I propose to do now is take a few questions and use the question as an entry point for exploration of a few of these very important passages. And in the process, they will answer many more questions than one could have asked. I think we can start with the first question.
We have a question from Michael. Why is trauma the trigger for out-of-body experience?
Yes. So why is trauma a trigger for out-of-body experiences? Not everybody who has trauma has an out-of-body experience. Not everyone who has experience need have had trauma. But it does happen occasionally under certain circumstances which are very traumatic. People have found themselves spontaneously out of the body. The mother narrates one such when she had come out of a restaurant in Paris and had just eaten food and the stomach was slightly not well. She found the body suddenly collapsing just as they stepped out of the restaurant. The body collapsing and herself out of the body and looking at the body and saying, "What is this? You're not allowed to do this to me." So she comes back to the body and scolds the body, "You don't do this to me again." And she narrates this as an example. Of course, that was not a very serious trauma. But what I will read from is another text of the mother where she addresses this question in passing. Actually, the topic itself which she covers is quite remarkably rich and has many profound aspects. But this also will be answered in passing. So I'm using, as you can see, questions as a starting point often and widening the scope of the questions. Yes? Yeah. Okay. So, somebody asked the mother a question. This is from 27th April 1955. What is the difference between a symbolic dream and a vision? And mother starts speaking about sleep and dreams and things like that, and visions. Quite close to, anyway, the theme that we are at. But then she gets into certain aspects of it which are quite deep. So I'll read selectively a few lines and then we'll go to the deeper part. So first reply she gives is, usually one has a vision when one is not asleep, when one is awake. When one is awake and enters within oneself, whether in meditation or concentration, one has visions. Or at night you can't sleep, remain stretched out, remain quiet, don't sleep, and you may have visions. She's talking to children, so. Dreams come when one is asleep. That is when one has no longer the waking consciousness. Whereas in vision, one is in the waking consciousness. But one quietens and immobilizes it, and it is another more inner consciousness which awakens. Yet one is not asleep. The body is not asleep. It is just made quiet. Now these are things which anybody who has done some deep meditation will be familiar with as a description. But now comes something very subtle, and she's talking to children, so she gives something, a vocabulary and a description which is accessible to them. So she says, one can have visions even while remaining active. Some people have visions even amidst activity. Vision is another plane of perception which awakes. It is the senses in the mind or vital or physical which wake up and manage to pass their experiences to the outer consciousness. It is as though one had another pair of eyes behind these, eyes which could see in the vital instead of seeing in the physical. And this is always there. Only as one is concentrated on the most material life, one doesn't notice it. So it's like you have those eyes where they are seeing things in the vital. You don't notice because you are fixated in your physical eyes. But some children have the two conjointly. They see even physically all kinds of things which are not physical, because it's as if the other vision overlays the physical. So you cannot distinguish what is physical and what is vital. Usually they are told that they are saying stupid things, so they stop speaking about them. But they don't see just this only physically, they see other things behind. One can have visions with closed eyes, one can have visions with open eyes. While dreaming, one is always asleep. So this distinction she has made. Now in passing, when she's speaking of this eyes behind, I want to point this out because this is how the experience actually happens when the inner sight opens. One has literally the sense as if eyes open, but in the grade of consciousness appropriate to whichever is the level where you are having this experience. So this can take place in a kind of an inward shift of consciousness. It can take place in an upward shift of consciousness. In fact, there are natural centers above the head, and as you find yourself centered there, literally when you isolate yourself from the physical body and are fully there, you can literally as if open awareness with an intent of perception, and the feeling is like eyes opening. Although there are no physical eyes, there are no eyelids and so on. But the feel is similar in terms of the sense of opening or choosing to close a perception. Then again the question is asked between symbolic dream and other dreams and so on. Now comes the part specific to this question. There is a question of Jyotindra. He wanted to know, when one is in much pain or is very irritated, how can one sleep peacefully? Mother's reply: this indeed needs a certain yogic power. The best way, and this one is absolute, is to go out of one's body. When the body is in pain, when one has fever or is ill, you see, or the body is very ill, the only thing to do is to come out of it, to bring out one's vital being. And then if one is a yogi and knows, one rises just above so as to see his body, the vital being. If it has come out in a fairly material form, can see the body. One sees his own physical body, and then at that moment, with the consciousness one has and the force one has, one can direct the rays of these forces on the place in the body which is ill. But this, of course, is the peak. It is the surest way of curing oneself. And if one has the power and the knowledge, it is infallible. Okay, I need to pause here with the word infallible so that you take time to internalize what she is saying. If one has the power and the knowledge, it is infallible. It is the surest way of curing oneself. Now, just for this reason, as a way of curing yourself of any kind of illness, one would say, looks like it might be useful to develop the capacity to go out of the body. So, I'm not going to the question of misuse. We will discuss that with Geminus in a much more profound discussion, but understanding the utility of it now. And so, what she is describing when she is answering the question, when one is in much pain or is very irritated, how can one sleep peacefully? The best way, and this one is absolute, is to go out of one's body. She is not saying, look, there is a way to do that, that's difficult, you should not try, it is dangerous, stay in your body and do something else. She is telling you the best way is to go out of one's body. And then what to do, exactly what to do. And she keeps reminding you that you have to develop the capacity. And then you direct the rays of these forces on the place of the body which is ill. Detailed description of how to cure yourself from an out of body state. And then she continues, one can cure oneself of anything, whatever, in a very short time. Only, all this means a great practice, a training of the being. It does not come all at once, you see. But in fact, when the pain is intolerable and people faint, they do this instinctively. To faint is to go out of one's body. So, some people who are not too closely tied to their body, when something goes wrong, becomes too painful or is not all right, they faint. Too great a pain makes you faint away. That is, you go out of your body. You really go out and leave the body very inert. And provided someone is there who has enough knowledge not to shake you like this, to wake you up, it is a means of escape from suffering. Of course, if you have beside you someone who is panic-stricken and sprinkles cold water on your head or shakes you, then the result can be disastrous. But otherwise, one can. And little by little, as there is no longer any consciousness there to record the suffering, it becomes calm, the body becomes calm. And in almost every case, the body becomes motionless enough to be able to rest, even in spite of the suffering. It doesn't feel it at all any longer. This is the best way. There are minor methods. They have smaller results. They are not very easy either. That is, the knowledge of the power to cut the connection between the suffering part and the recording brain. One cuts the connection, then the brain does not register. That's what one does, what the doctors do with anesthetics. They cut the connection of the nerves between the spot that is ill and the brain. So the brain no longer perceives anything, or it is reduced to a minimum. And it always comes back to the same thing, one way or another. And all this calls for an occult power or training. Now, at this point I'll pause again just to remind you that she has already answered the question why trauma is sometimes accompanied by an out-of-body experience. Now, what she has said is the vital body separates. It doesn't mean that the person is fully conscious in that state. Even if they were conscious, even if they registered themselves out of the body, they may forget completely on return, which is more often the case even. So, not that everyone even experiences or remembers. But when it happens, this is the reason why it tends to happen when there is a trauma experience, let's say. So, specifically with regard to the question asked, Michael, why is trauma the trigger for OBE? It may be occasionally, need not always be. And generally it is in an unhealthy condition when extreme trauma for extreme pain or sometimes psychological pain may also cause a dissociation or even a projection out of the body. Now, there have been traditions which have tried to use this as a way of provoking that separation, sometimes as a way of training, sometimes as a way of interfering with natural evolution in order to harm the person. But, well, both of these exist. Often it happens, for example, in times of war, when there is some extreme distress, and even under kinds of torture where there is some kind of automatic separation from the sheer pain. The idea is to compel the intelligence to separate so that it can no more control what the body speaks, and the body will then spill the secrets. So there are both positive and negative uses of this, unfortunately. So as far as I'm concerned, now the question is answered and something much more broad is taken up. So I'm going to complete with the text because there is so much that she's sharing here, and we will pause occasionally for observations. Now here she has already spoken of minor method, which is the capacity, knowledge and power to cut the connection between the suffering part and the recording brain. It's again a power of concentration. If you look at our prior discussions about the power of concentration, to be able to withdraw awareness from external noises, for example, but also internally, subjectively from your own physical body sensations, to be able to withdraw awareness. It's easier in the extremities of the body, often the legs, because they are the least conscious. Hands slightly less easy because they are more conscious. But otherwise, but when the pain is somewhere in this region, that is head, face, chest, where we are generally more conscious, it's more difficult to withdraw because it's too close to our center of sense of I. Nevertheless, if you are used to deep meditation, and if you have actually taken the trouble to consciously develop the capacity to go really, really deep, to the point where you become unaware of the world, you're not unconscious, you're simply withdrawn from the world awareness. You're not out of the body, you're simply withdrawn in awareness. And the body feels numb, or at least to you it becomes numb. And on the return, when you slowly reconnect and reinfuse, and just from the meditation, you have never gone out of the body. And yet the consciousness was withdrawn and there's a pleasant numbness into which you reconnect. This ability already gives you capacity to do this. But it's not so easy to do it when you are in pain, because the pain is like a thread that keeps pulling you out. But you have the capacity already. So purely from a spiritual training, but taken to a certain level of competence, one would have developed this, what she calls the minor method, which has a smaller result. And this should be possible to do at least for minor things. There's another way, again a variant of this, which is done by a mental separation. So I have shared perhaps an experience I had when I was about 12 or 13, and I was working with a soldering iron. Those years your coordination may not be so developed, and occasionally you tend to be lax, and the tip of the soldering iron came on the finger, and there was a welt, burning welt, which immediately formed within a few minutes, paining like crazy, burning pain, severe, intense, so much that it could felt as if overwhelming everything. So that's I put it in water, I put it in ice, the pain subsides. I take it out, again it starts. I put it in ice, it subsides. I take it out, it starts. So by that time the rationality had settled, and the mind went okay. And by the way, for those who are fans of Frank Herbert's novel Dune, there's this scene which is shown in the movie also, where this young man who is going to be a potential future king is tested by the nuns. They put his hand in a box and switch on pain, and he experiences the most agonizing pain, and they keep raising it until by force of will he is able to dissociate and hold his hand steady. In the movie, it's a very interesting idea. The nun puts a poison dart next to his neck and says, if you move, you're dead. When the test is complete and he has passed it, she explains that a person who would be living by instinct and could not control the pain and would pull the hand out would not be worthy of the power that would come with that position of the ruler. It's a very interesting idea, and this is, I'm digressing, but a very important part of the training which used to be for those who would be future leaders. In the past days, when the king was still brought up for a position and trained for the position with certain competence. This basic self-control, self-mastery, without which you do not have the right to be master over others or even over situations. So I'm coming back to this idea of the pain and the ability to separate, and my experience when I was looking at this, that story I had read. So it was somewhere deeply rooted. I said, and when I read it, it struck me, yes, of course, this has to be so. And I said, here is my finger. It's already been burnt. It's more than 15 minutes past when I got the burn. I put it in cold water. Nothing is going to get worse. And yet the pain is rising. What is it really? And I intellectualized it, rationalized it to myself. It's just signals of the nerves. There's no real burning, there's no damage taking place. And I kept convincing the mind and disengaging from the pain itself purely by a mental means. What was fascinating was the pain kept building. And I fancied myself with the memory of that, the experience of the novel. I said, I should be able to do this. So it kept building, and it reached a point where it was pulsating, throbbing, seemed as if to invade the whole person. And still I held, and it was a purely mental poise. This is purely signals of the nerves registered in the brain. No other value, no destruction taking place in tissue. So it went to this, which could be the most intense I could have conceived of, more than I could have conceived of. And then suddenly, poof, it was extinguished. Just like that, in an instant. Gone, stopped. And it did not return for the rest of, till it healed. All the days. I didn't have to put it in ice, nothing. Just like that, it stopped. Fascinating as an experience, but this would be one of these, smaller methods, minor methods, etc. for that particular thing. Of course, there was no healing involved. So as a method also, it has a limited effect, just managing to handle pain. That's about it. So I come back to the text of the mother. Some people have, and it always comes back to the same thing, one way or another, and all this calls for an occult power or training. Some people have it spontaneously. There are not many of these, very few. But obviously, without going so far, there is one thing that one can try to do. It is not to concentrate on one's pain, to turn the attention away as much as possible, not think of all of one's pain, think as little as possible, and above all, not to be concentrated on it, not to pay attention. Oh, I am in pain, then it becomes a little worse. Oh, I am in still greater pain, then it becomes still worse. Like that, because one is concentrated on it. And this is the mistake one always makes, to think, be there, attentive, awaiting the sign of pain. Then naturally it comes. It comes increased by the concentration of the attention given to it. So you wake up, hey, where's my pain? Oh, there it is. Oh, but it's mild today. And you keep paying attention until it grows. Ah, yes, now it's back to what it was. This is how it's supposed to be, right? Now, if you start doing this, gradually that pain begins to spread. And there are many forms in which it can take place, which have now names given, which seem to be very psychophysiologically connected. One of these forms is fibromyalgia, where you get pain pretty much all over the body, even eventually. But it starts with something small, and by the attention given, by the indulgence, and by the non-correction, it can grow very quickly. And you will see it shifts with your mood. When your attention is distracted, you're interested with something, all the symptoms vanish. When you have nothing to do, you're bored, you're fed up, you're unhappy, you're sad, the pain returns with double vigor. And so it has a strong psychological component, and yet it is very much physical. And it's being registered even in physical tissue. But so this is how generally it begins to form. So it comes increased by the concentration of the attention given to it. So you wake up, where's the pain? Ah, yes, it's there. Ah, I'm back to my normal self in pain. So you've actually accepted subliminally, subconsciously, you've accepted that you need to be in pain, which gives it permission to stay. That is why when one is not well, the best thing to do is to read or have something read. You see, it depends on the condition one is in. If one can turn one's attention away, one no longer suffers. So again, somebody asks, why do we dream? So she replies, why do you walk on your feet with the head in the air? Why do you eat and sleep? It is like that. Dreams are not something imposed upon you like that artificially. It's not like you were sent to school to learn. So I'm skipping that. She says they are a part of the body's functioning. And then comes another question. When one sleeps, the consciousness is different from the waking consciousness. Mother, and yes, and so? Why? How is it different? The questioner asks. Mother's reply. Now it gets into an interesting sphere, so we will look at this in some detail. But the mother says, but you have never noticed that it is different? For example, your physical consciousness or your subtle physical consciousness, your vital consciousness or the consciousness of your higher or lower vital, your psychic consciousness, your mental consciousness, each one is completely different. So, when you sleep, you have one consciousness, and when you are awake, you have another. In your waking state, you look at things projected outside you. In your sleep state, you see them interiorized. So it is as though in one case you are pushed altogether outside yourself in front, and in the other it is as though you were looking at yourself in an inner mirror. But you notice the point she is making is the grade of consciousness is the same, except turned out or turned in. And this is a very important clue, not only for out-of-body experiences, which is the broad theme, but also for dreams, for lucid dreams, for visions, for spiritual development generally. Key is in this, a grade of consciousness in which you can be out or in. Where's the grade? Mother says, don't understand? Not very well? Well, it's something one must learn to distinguish, one's state of consciousness, because otherwise one lives in a perpetual confusion. In fact, it is the first step on the path. It is the beginning of the thread. If one doesn't hold on to the end of the thread, one is lost on the way. End of the thread means the tip. This is only to hold the end of the thread. So again here she's saying it. She knows most children won't take it seriously. Most adults won't take it seriously, but she has to say it, so she says it. What she said, and I would suggest this as a practice for everybody. It's something one must learn to distinguish, one's state of consciousness, because otherwise one lives in a perpetual confusion. Now, what form will it take practically? As you observe, you notice how your state shifts. Right now, I was happy, I just saw some news and I became sad. When I became sad, there was this shift, I began to behave in this grouchy way, I responded in that way, which is uncharacteristic of me. I found my energy is low, etc. Rather than saying, oh, I am unhappy, I am sad, observe how your grade of consciousness shifted. Rather than just giving a superficial descriptive name, you observe the shift in levels, parts and quality of consciousness. Observe. You don't have to be able to name it. You don't have to say, this is the lower vital, that's the higher vital, this is some intermediate grade between lower vital and physical. Not important. Notice, observe the quality. And after a point, you'll notice the quality corresponds to certain descriptions. And you might say, perhaps this is what is called that. Doesn't matter. The name is not important. But once I've become familiar with this grade, I discover myself pushed into another grade. But what makes me shift from this grade to that grade? How did I snap into that? That event provoked it. Why can't I get back to this? Because there's a gap. I notice the gap. I notice I can't jump back. I'm stuck here. Of course, if somehow someone distracts me at this moment, I go and watch a movie or somebody speaks with me on the phone and I forget myself momentarily, I come back and I'm back here because that's my habitual state. So I switched from the bad news from the habitual state to this lower state, When I got distracted, I switched back and I didn't even realize. But in between, I could not shift either from the higher to the lower or the lower to the higher. Why? Lack of continuity. It is habit which throws you back because you're used to living in that. But that same habit which pulls you up from a lower state also pulls you down from a higher state. And for the same problem, between the higher and the lower, there's lack of continuity. Observe this. So the first thing she's saying is learn to distinguish, because otherwise one lives in a perpetual confusion. You made me angry. I am so unhappy. My life is whatever. And you're swinging between all these different compulsions and trapped in each state at all times, not knowing what's happening, why or where you're going, and helplessly trapped. That's not acceptable. Therefore, she says, in fact, it is the first step on the path. It is the beginning of the thread. And if one doesn't hold on to this thread, one has lost on the way. And this is only to hold to the thread, she says. Now, the theme continues, and but the question changes. Someone asks, when one sees oneself dead in a dream, what does it signify? And she says, I've been asked this many times. It depends on the context. It can mean that one has made enough progress to get rid totally of an old way of being which has no longer any reason for existing. This is the most frequent case. Otherwise, it depends on the context. That is, one sees himself dead. How does he see himself dead? Does he simply see the inert body, or himself already dead, or does he take for dead what is not dead? Now all the variations which would come. And now comes the description which goes into what we are looking at. You see, if you leave your body by going out of the body, as I have explained a while ago, if you have gone out materially enough in a very material vital, well, the body which is lying on the bed seems absolutely dead. But it is not dead for all that. But if you look at it or see it while you are outside and you don't know, it seems absolutely dead. It is in a cataleptic state. Then if you know what is necessary and what you ought to do, it is very easy. But if you don't know and the imagination starts roaming, then you open the door to fear and anything may happen. But in fact, I don't think that once in a million times it is a premonitory dream. I think it much more likely that it is a fragment of the being that has stopped being useful and so disappears. She's talking about the dream of being dead. So the fragment takes the form of the whole and one sees himself dead because this fragment has stopped existing in him. This is the most frequent and the most logical instance. Now, one may see not a death, for example, an accident or an assassination or things like that. Then it is a very real violent dream, and this may mean that one is attacked by bad forces, sent by someone with a precise purpose. Then one has only to strike hard and react violently. Next question. Sometimes one is asleep, he knows that he is asleep but can't open his eyes. Why? Mother. This happens when one has gone out of his body, and one must not force things. One must quite simply, slowly concentrate his consciousness in his body and wait a while for the fusion to be made normally. One must not force things. Questioner. Sometimes the eyes are a little open and one can see things. Mother says, and one can't move. He says, yes. Mother comments. It means that only a fragment of the consciousness has come back, not enough to bring back the full movement in the body. You must not shake yourself because you risk losing a bit of yourself. You must remain quite still and concentrate slowly on your body. It can take a minute or two at the most. Questioner. What can one lose? Mother. Anything at all. Something that has gone out, you see. It's because one part of the being has gone out. So if you shake yourself, it doesn't have the time to get back. So there's someone behind you, she points to Nalini, who has had an experience of this kind. Someone startled him out of his sleep, and when he came back, he had truly the feeling that something was missing. Isn't that so? Mother turns to Nalini. Nalini, yes. Then I told him, Mother says, to concentrate quietly. It came back. Only if one is afraid it can become complicated, you see. One must never startle anyone out of his sleep because he must have time to get back into his body. It is not good, for instance, when getting to jump out of bed, hop. You must remain quiet for a while like this gesture, as though you were bringing yourself back into yourself like this, quietly, quietly. When you are quite calm, when you feel that everything is there, then you get up and it is over. But you must never jump out of bed abruptly. It is not good. Besides, sometimes it happens that those who wake up abruptly and jump out of bed feel giddy and risk falling. You must always make a movement like this, as though you were gathering your consciousness or all kinds of things which may be gathered in one's body. You remain very quiet for a few seconds of assimilation, and when it is done properly, you get up quietly, composedly. Now, the talk ends here, but why I gave this importance is because two reasons. Because we have been suggesting certain practices for relaxing the body and having a out-of-body experience using whatever method of relaxation or the velo or whatever else. In any of these practices you might have done, there is always some partial separation. You may not experience full separation, but you will experience a partial separation. Many of you already have felt yourself in the subtle body, where you don't feel your gross body anymore, and yet you are not separated, but you are distinctly in your subtle body, or some grade of the subtle. When you return from that exercise, allow that time to integrate. You are developing a capacity to shift between levels and then to remain in exclusive focus in one grade, separate from the other. At that point, your gross body already has, so to say, less of you, and you're close to having an out-of-body experience. But from there on the return, whether just from this basic practice or from an out-of-body experience, you would follow this very slowly. Allow everything, all these layers which have, so to say, stretched out, swelled out, extended out, decompressed, widened out, whatever form it may be, allow it slowly to settle, gather, integrate into the gross physical body. Now, I'm not separating these exercises from basic practices of meditation, and especially deep meditation. Exactly the same thing applies in meditation. During meditation, whether you intended it with that way or not, if you have gone deep enough inward, upward, to any state or wideness or some opening to something vaster, whatever the experience you have been in, a part of you was almost fully immersed in that, during which time your body was not sharing in those parts at least. And there has to be a time allowed for those parts to slowly integrate. Now, especially if you have been in an experience of a vast, wide consciousness. On the return, your body is so small, limited and finite, dull, heavy. You could say, I've come back now, I should get up, I finished my meditation and rush. But the part which was in the experience is kind of left hanging behind. And with it, the loss of the experience itself. So you allow, you wait. And from a wide to a narrow, it takes time. Allow the sense of the wideness to settle into the body consciousness. Let it, so to say, open out as if in a continuity to that wide experience. For example, if that's what it was, or any other. And then allow that wideness to settle in. Allow the integration until that thing is yours with full eyes open and engagement in the gross physical body. And then you get up, retaining the fullness of the experience, not losing it. Now you have gained something, and perhaps in a more stable, lasting way. But if you got up suddenly, it would be left and it will fade out. So this description is extremely important. It's not just about sleep. It's for any experience, whether out of body, whether some deep concentration in a part, partial or full separation, or in deep meditation, or any experience of a spiritual or other kind. Because the thing which is having the experience is not in the body. It must be allowed time to return fully and integrate fully in the body. So in a sense, this also indirectly reminds us of that process where even the memory of that state has to be infused into the physical body and the body's brain cells, memory cells, nervous cells, etc. So you're building a link, building a continuity. So this is one of the more important passages, and I think you can appreciate the importance of something so easily spoken to children. If you read it casually without the larger context, oh, it was all about sleep, dreams. No, the knowledge being revealed was something far more profound and rich, which applies in so many other things. The principle she has stated. But because she is talking to children and people who are not too interested even in doing, and she knows most people won't even bother, they just heard a nice talk and walked away. So she's telling it to you anyway, and that's it. But okay, so that was one. We'll go to the next question, which is two people have asked similar questions, Riyadh and Rumble.
So, two related questions. Riyadh, does out-of-body experience bring to the spiritual growth in the context of the integral yoga? And Rampal, why do you recommend OB? Why not you just focus on yoga?
Yes. So the question is the context of the integral yoga and why we are spending so much time on out of body experience, whereas normally, as you will see, people will say, oh, all that is occultism, stay out of it, don't waste your time, do your sadhana and stay in the practice. And okay, generally that is speech of the ignorant. When one has a real experience of any kind, spiritual or an out of body experience, which I don't classify as spiritual, nevertheless helpful to spiritual growth. When one has an experience of this kind, the value of the experience is your reference. And it is generally those who have not had the experience or who have not glimpsed it in some way, even partially, who will say things like that. Or they misread or misunderstand a warning given in a certain context and generalize the context. And the principle is valid, that you do not chase after experiences which are normally classified as occult and not directly spiritual. But if an experience naturally unfolds, and it unfolds in the sequence of your current spiritual evolution, not contradicting it, not deviating from it, but even possibly as a flowering of it into side directions which correspond to that grade. So it's a flowering, the petals open sideways, but you're still moving forward. Then it has a place, perhaps for you, perhaps not for everyone. Even then you may choose to ignore those things. You don't need to chase or develop, you don't need to. Or if it does not interfere with the larger working, you may choose also partially to develop parallelly, if that happens naturally. So this being the broad context for anything, we will look at now what this particularly corresponds to from a letter of Sri Aurobindo, where he discusses several phenomena of this kind. This is a letter to Bahrain in 1922, dated 9th December 1922, and he is replying to a question from Jyotish Ghosh, or a letter of Jyotish Ghosh, and he explains this. The present condition, okay, I'll read from the beginning. I have read carefully Jyotish Ghosh's letter, and I think the best thing is first to explain his present condition as he describes it, for he does not seem to me to understand the true causes and the meaning. Now what has happened is this man has had some occult experiences of some kind, and he doesn't know what to make of it, but it came incidentally to having begun a certain line of sadhana. So Sri Aurobindo writes now, the present condition of passivity and indifference is a reaction from a former abnormal state to which he was brought by an internal effort not properly guided from without or from within. Now it can happen, you make a special effort, do something, and it may not be of a very not aligned to the psychic intimation, but you did it because, well, people say you do it. So the effort brought about a breaking of the veils which divide the physical from the psychic and vital worlds. Now remember, here he is using the word psychic in the sense of the conventional sense of psychic powers, not the psychic being, which is not used in this context. So the breaking of the veils which divide the physical from the psychic and vital worlds. But his mind was unprepared and unable to understand his experiences and judge them by the light of fancy and imagination and erroneous mental and vital suggestions. His vital being, full of rajasic and egoistic energy, rushed up violently to enjoy these new fields and use the force that was working for its own lower ends. So there's an action of a higher force, something happened, certain things opened, and the lower passions now grab what is being given and turn it for their use. This gave an opportunity for a hostile power from the vital world to break in and take partial possession, and the result was disorganization of the nervous and physical system and some of the brain centers. The attack and possession seem to have passed out and left behind the present reaction of passivity with a strong hold of tamas and indifference. So there's an exhaustion in the system from whatever instability that came in. The tamas and indifference are not in themselves desirable things, but they are temporarily useful as a rest from the past unnatural tension. The passivity is desirable and a good basis for a new and right working of the Shakti. So there is still the working of the higher force, which the ego, desire, complex, rajasic, egoistic energy rushed up to seize and distort. So, and this can happen to anybody who is seeking a higher opening. It doesn't mean you have tried to do anything occult. Now comes the important portion here. It is not a true interpretation of his condition that he is dead within and there is only an outside activity. What is true is that the center of vital egoism that thinks itself the actor has been crushed, and he now feels all the thought and activity playing outside him. This is a state of knowledge. For the real truth is that all these thoughts and activities are natures and come into us or pass through us as waves from the universal nature. It is our egoism and limitation in the body and individual physical mind which prevent us from feeling and experiencing this truth. It is a great help to be able to see and feel the truth as he is now doing. This is not of course the complete knowledge. As the knowledge becomes more complete and the psychic being opens upwards, one feels all the activities descending from above and can get at their true source and transform them. So he describes certain other experiences of the light playing in his head, opening to the higher force, knowledge, electric current is the force descending in the lower centers and preparing the light, etc. The light should descend into the lower centers, etc. I'm skipping that. These describe the experiences of descent he is having. Now comes the point of this whole discussion. The utility of psychic experiences and knowledge of the invisible worlds as of other yogic experiences is not to be measured by our narrow human notions of what may be useful for the present physical life of man. So very often we might say simply, oh, what's the use? I don't need it. And it's true. But that's not the correct criteria, he says. You may still follow that, that's irrelevant. But what is the correct criteria for these powers or these experiences or the knowledge of invisible worlds? What would be the criteria by which we assess their value? And he gives us now the criteria. 3 things, he says. First, in the first place, these things are necessary for the fullness of the consciousness and the completeness of the being. Psychic experiences and knowledge of invisible worlds as of other yogic experiences. All this, he says, are necessary for the fullness of the consciousness and the completeness of the being. Now, in an ascetic path which aims at a withdrawal, let's say into self or nirvana, self-extinction, none of this is important because it is a trap, it's a danger even, because it will distract. For an integral yoga which aims at a transformation of the whole being and a divinization and a full participation in the entire cosmos as a conscious participant, as a divine center of light and force, knowledge, love, you have to become conscious of these domains. You have to be able to act with these powers which exist anyway in nature. If you are not conscious of them, they still operate. So to be unconscious of them is not a mastery. So, necessary for the fullness of the consciousness and the completeness of the being. In the second place, these other worlds are actually working upon us. And if you know and can enter into them, then instead of being the victims and puppets of these powers, we can consciously deal with, control, and use them. So, how would it be an integral yoga which aims eventually at a mastery? And I use the word eventually very clearly. You don't have to do all this in the beginning, but it will come eventually. So, in the eventual aspect of the yoga, and that comes already in the fourth Chatushtaya, not in the first few, the awareness of these worlds, the awareness of the forces that act from these worlds upon us will naturally develop. And when that happens, rather than being a puppet and a victim of all these influences, you become aware, oh, that's what the influence is about. That's the thing in trying to push, pull, or modify. And maybe at first you can't intervene, but at least you're conscious and you can refuse. And with that begins already the ability to intervene, refuse selectively, and then eventually even operate and access. Because already refusal means you have a certain influence and a capacity. So, to be able to consciously deal with them, control and use them, frees you from being a puppet and a victim of forces, because they are acting on you anyway. Just because you are ignorant doesn't mean that's not happening. In fact, the point the mother makes about thoughts, for example, she says something like 99% of the thoughts we have are coming from outside. You're not even conscious. And so many emotions come from outside. We have recently had elections. You saw how the mood was swung by rumors, by media, by powerful forces pushing strong headlines which had nothing to do with the priority of that moment. They came up powerfully for 1 or 2 days and then vanished when their utility was over. To swing the mood, to create a mood. And these are gigantic formations thrust upon the masses to shift their thinking and behavior. If there were a wave of a fear energy and it hits a mass, everybody will feel suddenly lifted in that fear. Lifted, I mean agitated in the fear. Not uplifted, agitated, risen by the excitation. And if a deep peace is descending, suddenly everybody will feel a great calm. And this could be done by one person, if they're sufficiently conscious and developed on a whole mass, just like that. And that's the kind of power that a developed yogi could have wielding in the universal domain, because his consciousness is also already sufficiently universalized. Even otherwise, in a local space, one person could have that impact in that local space. So, and then of course, things you may do or not be conscious of and be a victim of, you could at least resist or modify, and it would have consequences that you are not here fully conscious of. So, this was the second point. Thirdly, he says, in my yoga, that is in the integral yoga, the yoga of the supramental, the opening of the psychic consciousness to which these experiences belong is quite indispensable. Again, I highlight the word indispensable. In other words, you can't do this yoga without this opening eventually having to take place. For it is only through the psychic opening that the supramental can fully descend with a strong and concrete grasp and transform the mental, vital and physical being. Now, this psychic opening he is using in a vocabulary which includes the psychic being, but the entire domain, which is the domain that is rightfully belonging to the psychic being. So, all these worlds of the inner realm, inner mind, inner vital, inner physical. And he puts it another way, in another of the letters, where he says that if the true psychic, the soul within us, the psychic being, had to come forward and act, the physical body and the embodied mind and vital are too narrow, crude, dark and heavy with inertia for it to be able to do anything useful. They are, as instruments, it's almost useless. It can only act using the instrument of the inner mind, inner vital and inner physical, which are at least sufficiently pliable and can be made more conscious. So the awakening in those realms, eventually being able to live within them with the full domination of the true psychic being's influence and their psychicization, eventually all the way to the physical and the embodied mind, is a necessary part before one can have the descent of the supramental fully, taking up all these and transforming the mental, vital and physical being. So awakening to these inner domains of the inner mind, inner vital and inner physical automatically opens you to a certain capacity, at the very least an awareness of forces and things happening. And then depending on your temperament and prior work done, certain other capacities would tend to begin to open out spontaneously with you doing nothing else. And when they do open, you will not say, oh, this I have to now shun. It doesn't work. You say, all right, that's part of the natural consequence of being more aware here. Let me continue the process of becoming more deeply interiorized or aligned to the psychic influence and the higher spiritual action of the mother's force and so on, which is working to awaken you to all these levels, in all these levels. With it, spontaneously, there are perceptions which happen. Sometimes as you are walking, you look at somebody and suddenly you have a glimpse of the state they are in or why they are in that state. Or occasionally it may happen, you look at that and you, because you are in a different state, you say, oh, and something as if because of the state you are at and dwelling on that, it's as if an influence, not intentionally always, could go out and suddenly the person feels relieved momentarily. They may not know where it happens, why it happens. And you'll notice this. You will not say, oh, I did something. No, you didn't do anything. It happened. Oh, I will now do something. No, that would be an error. So, but these things happen. And when they happen, you'll observe, you'll grow conscious, and more all these movements, as along with all your thoughts and emotions, will be aligned to the psychic and the central aspiration and the higher working of the mother's force. And you will then see how rapidly it works to develop and awaken the fullness of your consciousness for the higher transformation. If at that moment you say, now I've got this, now I'll start using this, I'll start impressing others, you have immediately allowed a distortion of your ego, desire, claim, perverting a higher or inner, let's say, first opening to its self-aggrandizing, the error which was described with that man earlier. And with that distortion, either the experience begins to fade out because it doesn't belong to this narrowness, or because of your distortion, you lose the movement which had begun of the opening and the purification of the inner and higher consciousness. And that gets paused or diverted. But if you have a basic central sincerity, you're conscious, oh yeah, there's this part which is now tickled, it wants to play around. Okay. And then you may choose, let me see, how does this actually work? You experiment with it a little bit. That's interesting. But you don't seize it with a sense of ownership and make it an occasion to divert from the primary focus. So I think these are clarifications. If correctly understood, one need not fear what he describes as an indispensable passage of the opening to these experiences of the inner mind, inner vital and inner physical. The entire domain which is broadly classified as occult. But it's not occult. This was an interesting observation which Mark made last time when one of the questioners had used the word occult. He says you can't use the word occult because it is fully revealed. Occult by definition means hidden. So now Sri Aurobindo continues in the letter. This is the present condition and its value. So the condition of that person and the value of what is happening. For the future, if he wishes to accept my yoga, the conditions are a steady resolve and aspiration towards the truth I am bringing down, a calm passivity and an opening upward towards the source from which the light is coming. The Shakti is already working in him. And if he takes and keeps this attitude and has a complete confidence in me, there is no reason why he should not advance safely in the sadhana in spite of the physical and vital damage that has been done to his system. So, very interesting, very interesting. Sri Aurobindo is conscious of how he is directing his force to help these people, and he is getting regular feedback and making for these corrective guidances. Maybe I skipped one paragraph which described the movement of the descent. I will just read that also. It would put in context what could happen, for example, with this opening. Sri Aurobindo writes, the light playing in his head means that there has been an opening to the higher force and knowledge which is descending as light from above and working on the mind to illumine it. The electric current is the force descending in order to work in the lower centers and prepare them for the light. The right condition will come when, instead of the vital forces trying to push upward, the prana becomes calm and surrendered and waiting with full assent for the light. And when, instead of the chasm in between, there is a constant aspiration of the heart towards the truth above. The light must descend into these lower centers so as to transform the emotional and vital and physical being as well as the mental thought and will. So that was the para I had skipped. So here you see the utility of the psychic experiences and knowledge of the invisible worlds as well as other yogic experiences. And he says you cannot measure their value by utility of your present physical life. First he says these are necessary for the fullness of the consciousness and completeness of the being. Second, these worlds are already acting upon you, and instead of being a victim and a puppet, you can become conscious of them, deal with, control and use them. And third, in the yoga of the supramental, the opening of this consciousness to these experiences is quite indispensable, because it is only by this psychic opening that the supramental can fully descend with a strong and concrete grasp and transform the mental, vital and physical being. So here I am reading this out in response to the two questions of Riyad and Rumpel. Out of body experience is a small part of this awakening and growth of the consciousness. So to Rumpel about why do you recommend OBE, why not just focus on the yoga, I am going to come to a few more things, but because it is inevitable, because it is in the nature of your awareness of your subtle bodies or layers of consciousness. As you become conscious of them, as you develop the link and the continuity between these layers, automatically you will have the capacity to at least sense things happening on that domain outside you as well as inside you, in the worlds outside as well as within, and also to intervene. And as part of that, incidentally, the ability to partially focus upon, project or exteriorize partially or fully would inevitably follow. So one of the points I had made earlier was, as an experience it is worth having at least once, and that's generally enough to give you a sense of, and then whether you choose to develop or not would be a different question. For myself, as I've mentioned before, at a certain age I did have an experience, but the inner clearance was not there, and I felt that. I knew I would misuse. What it was, I don't know the form of the misuse, and it was not important. Only at a certain level, when the foundation within was sufficiently stable, and I could feel the difference when that was stable, then it was as if a block was removed. Well, now it doesn't matter. Do or not do doesn't matter. It's not important. But coming specifically to the question of why OBE, out of body experience, and its relevance to spiritual growth in the context of integral yoga, I will put it in these terms. We will get a perhaps more complete response in the discussion we will have with Geminus, because he will have aspects of experience which will really complete this part. But I will stick to my experience and limit it to that, and what comes from an understanding of a deeper understanding of the nature of the human being and the processes of the yoga. First, you recognize your mind and its intelligence, its creativity, its imagination, its powers of induction, deduction, visualization, creativity, memory, everything is enormously dimmed by the fact that it has blended in and bound itself into the biology of your physical brain and body. This same mind, slightly separated from the brain, suddenly you find your mind is so light, free, clear, wide, plastic, intuitive, insightful, creative, and so on, imaginative, everything. Suddenly all the powers of mind become so much more free. You come back drawn into the physical identification with brain and body, and you feel the heaviness and dullness. Your mind is narrowed, dark and heavy. I'm taking this as an example because all of us have experienced this. And it takes very little to free the mind. So one of the practices Sri Aurobindo suggests is concentration above the head till you're centered here, and then you just shifting the level up. And I've had this happen once. I'd just eaten food. I was dull, heavy. There was inertia, tamas. The mind was like this. And somebody came and he didn't have time. He needed something from me. I said, I'll send it to you later. He says, but can't you just shift yourself out? I said, okay. Consciously shifting the center above head. It took about, 1 or 2 minutes. Poof, the whole thing was free, clear. And I could dictate what was required precisely with no error. He took it down. His work was done. He left. And I said to myself, why don't I live on that all the time? There are issues. And maybe that's a longer discussion. But just to show you, freed mind from embodied, fully embodied mind. Now, when you shift here, you're not free from the embodying. You're just free from the dullness of the physical brain. Sri Aurobindo's words. He says, freed from the physical brain, you can think freely and much more widely and even in a different way as you experience when you are more settled here. But the moment you come in, it's like everything is dulled and lost. But you have not gone out of body. The same thing happens when you go deep into concentration or meditation of some kind. Now it could be like a center above head where you open to the presence above. You go within, you open to or go deep enough to close to the psychic influence, or you go within and open out into a wider consciousness, or you experience the dawn or the influence of the presence or the self in various aspects, etc. But at that moment what happens, your consciousness as if withdraws from the physical body, is immersed in the experience. You're not out of body. You're very much embodied. But you've stopped identifying exclusively. Your entire awareness is turned inward. And if you have not developed this capacity to exclusively turn in, you can't get to any meaningful experience because the body dulls it. But freed from that, when you experience and with intensity, you hold the intensity and then you slowly infuse into the body. Something you could not have done if you remained stuck in the body consciousness. Now there are people who, I suppose it comes from partial reading or wrong understanding of Sri Aurobindo. They have this idea that, it is sadhana of the body, so I will stay in the body. I will do everything with eyes open and with my body. Okay, very slow, very laborious, and you will have pretty much wasted the bulk of your life opportunity. If you could consciously concentrate inward, upward to any deeper, higher state, experience that, which you can do very easily from that separation from the body identification, you can now bring that intensity of the experience and the reality and the full force of it into the body and give to it an experience you could never get by staying in the body all the time. Because in the very nature the body is so dull. Sri Aurobindo gives this example where he says, if you had an experience of the Brahman consciousness and you were fully identified with the body, you'd feel something momentarily and then you'll say, must have been my blood pressure or something, and you'll go on, not realizing the importance of that experience. And again, this is something which people have had. It's not such a big deal, and it's not that you have the whole of it. You have a touch of it. Having a touch of it is very much accessible for all kinds of things. So do not fear when I use these words. These are very much within reach. Even the touch of the experience of the self, touch of the experience of the Brahman, these are all very accessible. It's not at all difficult. And as a touch, suddenly you feel, suddenly everything appears so unreal. It happened to me when my teacher was imprinting these experiences. My teacher, MP Pandit, was imprinting these experiences. I had just completed my school, and a series of experiences just infused just like that, and that was his capacity. So one of those days I was cycling down behind the ashram, and I looked up and suddenly I saw everything looked like fake, like a cinema, what do you call that, stage set. Like if you poke, it will just break. It's made of cardboard or paper, unreal. And I looked at all that, and for momentarily it was like I was giddy. What's that? Is it my blood pressure? I actually thought that. It was not, obviously. It happened a couple of times, and then I said it to him, and he was serious. He didn't say anything, but Then I knew that it was an experience, and then I understood what it was also. But what was interesting was, at that time, because still the consciousness was not ready for this, I was focused on this, the loss of reality of the surface appearance. When looking back, I recognize why that lightheadedness, because underlying I was experiencing a deeper vast, against which this is felt unreal. Now this is the error we make in the initial opening to any experience. We grasp at what is lost, and the negation of what was, not the positive against which this is experienced as a negation or a limitation. So eventually that also dawned, and then the experience faded away. I did nothing to get it or even to keep it. At that time I was just allowing his work to carry spontaneously. So I'm giving this as an example because if you're bound in the body, you'll just say, oh, suddenly, I feel lightheaded. And then afterwards, for no reason, you're very cheerful, positive, optimistic, and something has shifted. I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened, although sometimes a most significant thing happened in the inner layers. I'll give another example, and this is something Sri Aurobindo explains in great depth. Whenever there's a descent, it takes place not in the gross body, it takes place in your subtle body. And then from the subtle body, it slowly spreads outward as an infusion into the gross body, to the extent that you take the trouble to receive and hold it. If you don't, at best you have an afterglow and it fades out. But the whole thing has taken place in the subtle body. And if you're not conscious in the subtle body, you have not registered consciously the descent. But if you are conscious in the body, you see what he just described in the text, the sense of the light and the electric current and all those things are so naturally directly felt in the subtle body. You don't have to go out of body, you have it here. But having felt it there, now you can infuse it into the gross body, acclimatize it, prepare it now to receive more and more directly what is received directly in the subtle grade of the physical. That is the subtle physical or inner vital or inner mental. That's what forms your subtle body broadly. That's where the descent takes place. I'll give another example which is more fascinating, and it was somewhat recent. I was, because of certain work, I was somewhat exteriorized. And then I felt, it was a meditation time, I felt a kind of a descent. I had not yet made effort of any kind, but there was a descent, it was beautiful. And then I said, but this I'm feeling in the gross body. What's happening inside? And so the conscious shift inside, and suddenly I experienced the full intensity of what had actually happened, which was not registered on the outside. And it was like tenfold more. But had I stayed on that layer, I would have said, it felt good, there was a nice descent, good. When I go in, then the full scope and even the quality is fully felt directly. So what I'm coming to is a step, I'll still come to the outer body experience. Recognizing that it is in these inner layers which are the true instruments of the psychic being, as well as the real action of the force from above, and the starting point for the sadhana itself of transformation, which must go all the way to the physical. But you cannot say, I will start with the physical. That would be the most foolish mistake. It starts with the mind and the higher part of the vital, which are necessarily more plastic, more open, more receptive, and top down, inside out. So the more quickly you are able to access something of the inner state and stay in it without being bound and dulled by the gross body, the more easily the access will be, and the resulting action in the sadhana and the pace of the sadhana. Because you can bring that experience into the gross body. You could of course go into there, have a nice experience, snap out into the gross body, lose the experience, leave it behind, forget it even, and fall back into the dullness and inertia, which also happens to a lot of people because they were not conscious or didn't build the bridge linking. So a critical part will be the slow infusion of the experience and the grade of consciousness where the experience took place into the gross body, by which you'll build the bridge. Now, does that remind you of something we just discussed last time and many times before? In the return from out of body experience, the necessity of infusing the memory, but also the imprint of the experience itself. Because what you're experiencing in the subtle body is fundamentally different from the physical senses. And there is no way the physical body has any equivalent of that experience, or those experiences, of many kinds of experience, even of the senses of those worlds or of that body. And when it comes back, it's as if you're teaching your gross physical body a new way to feel and know and be. Slow, gradual infusions, building links. Now comes the point of the outer body experience. You could do all this without having an outer body experience. You could go into deep states of concentration, meditation, even experience ranges of the higher worlds and higher grades of consciousness and bring those down all the way into the physical without ever going out of the body. And the amplifying factor would be whatever, 10-fold or even 100-fold, depending on which grade and how much you were able to fully concentrate in that grade, which you could bring into the body and thereby accelerate the whole sadhana. But when you go out of the body, in the vital body necessarily at first, and depending on which grade of the vital also, and you have heard a little bit about that, what you get is 1,000-fold more than this. At least that's what we are told. And so Geminus will amplify on this perhaps later. And so the same thing, if done in that out of body state, the reception and the containing of an experience, if turned for a spiritual purpose, could allow a far more intense infusion all the way into the physical. Even if you had no active spiritual life, if the experience itself was of a grade higher, even reasonably higher, it would bring into the body something of real value. I have met people who have out of body experiences quite frequently. They have a spiritual turn, but a paucity of a real spiritual experience, a complete lack of understanding, no context of the experiences they are having, and they have these beautiful experiences they come back with, and it has an imprint. It changes you. And then I say, I wish they had a little bit of context by which they could have made it a spiritual value, and then the amplifying effect would be so great. They may even have seen visions of deities, etc., because in the higher worlds, in the higher vital worlds, if you can develop to go there, you have all the heavens, including all the deities you can meet, but they will be in the vital grade, even in the higher vital grade, and each of these worlds leans towards the higher ranges. So anything you could have on the higher ranges will have its representation in the vital worlds. And they could be the most extraordinary and beautiful things which you will bring, and it will have a spiritual value, limited, bound within the grade of the vital. It would still not be truly liberating, but for a religious mind it would be perfect, and you could stop there, for example. So, coming back to the two questions, does OBE bring to this? What does OBE bring to the spiritual growth in the context of integral yoga? It can bring something very valuable if you take it in that way. But you don't need it. You can achieve the same thing by this movement of conscious interiorizing and opening to inner and higher ranges and attaining to those experiences and infusing and do the complete integral yoga without needing to have an out of body experience. On the other hand, you could have out of body experiences with no real spiritual value other than what comes just by the implicit fact that you experience a much larger sense of infinity and eternity in the higher vital ranges, and just that would change your sense of life, purpose, etc. But it would tend to be a more ascetic turn, meaning you would say, why do I want to come back to this dullness and heaviness of the gross body? Why not continue to live there? Of course you can't, so you're kind of kept here. And you would not have a clarity or understanding of what you're supposed to do or how you can use this for accelerating your spiritual growth. And I've met people like that. And so but they're so satisfied with what they have, there's not much you can say anyway. And it's fine, perhaps, for them. But if you have the background of the integral yoga and its priorities and the basic central alignment to your soul's aspiration and let's say, uncompromising commitment that you'll not allow yourself to be deliberately distracted. You will always be distracted, but not intentionally. At least you hold that. Then you can make enormous use of this by an amplifying factor that can enormously accelerate, because you can enter into experiences in a way far more complete and then work upon the physical body. And with this we understand the first text we read of the mother, where she says go out of the body and from there infuse the force, the light, the power into the physical. Why do you have to go out in your subtle body to do this? Why not do it while you're embodied? That's the point. When you're embodied, your access is so dramatically reduced that what you pull is barely a trickle. When you go out, you can literally access a downpour, almost an oceanic rushing force, and direct it. If you develop the capacity to draw, direct, etc. All of this has to grow. It has to happen if you want to really do that properly. Not all of us may be drawn to do that. Some of us may utilize the capacity for some minimal interventions. Some of us may, because of prior past life work done, have a spontaneous, let's say, skill by which we may be able to do much more. It's up to you really. But if you're clear the goal is not there, the goal is to access something deeper and higher and truer and bring it here and recast your entire surface nature in terms of the higher, then this can be a huge aid. And so to Rumpel, it is a part of the yoga focus if you take it in that spirit, which can enormously help. You can also use it as a means of distraction and make it a kind of a tourism, occult tourism, go about, see things. And it's fascinating. Maybe one would even do that occasionally just to satisfy oneself. But still, as long as the overall sense of purpose is clear, it will be fine. So again, going back to Mother's observations, when she says, do this, and the other texts which I will read later, where she says, well, can you go out of the body? And then she describes what you need to do and so on. So she's not saying don't do. She speaks of the dangers, and the dangers are also there. She says, first condition, you should not be afraid. And that's good enough as a starting point. The rest will be taken care of mostly by a deeper discrimination that you would have, without which very unlikely that you would be even allowed to enter into those experiences. It may happen, for example, you're given an experience and then it doesn't happen. Because understand, there are beings, powers, which will help to prevent you from getting into trouble. If you have a basic integrity of purpose. And the point which Mark made last time, you will not be able to have the experience if you have not done a basics kind of development. So what is the nature of that development? I'm going to read from another passage of the Mother, but we have run out of time. It's a longish passage. I'm going to keep this for next time because it's very important. And she explains the nature of the development you must have, and then the kinds of things or levels which are available even in terms of exploration and for purpose of the spiritual growth that can be used. So since today I have read from two passages, these two I will put the links for them in the description. Right now there is nothing put, but a little later, within an hour or so, I will put them. And I think I've hopefully answered these questions with sufficient depth. I'll quickly look at the chat box. So RPX is saying, in this challenging time, what type of siddhi one needs to cultivate to stay on the path. That's precisely the thing we should not do. Don't aim at siddhis. You aim at the organizing of your thoughts, emotions, actions around your deepest aspiration that you can access, the deepest center you can feel, or the influence of that as you can. Just that, organizing yourself and your life around this center, is the siddhi. Siddhi means perfection, but normally the word is used to describe powers. You don't need powers. You need this, which has an automatic discrimination, being the psychic being within you, which knows the truth from the mixture. That is what we all need to prevent us from being misled or led astray by deceptive appearances. So that would be, I think, the most important priority. The other questions which are quite complex, which perhaps we'll take up after. Okay, so Amelia is asking, you speak of the finger burning and the box scene in Dune as example of training the consciousness through pain. Can we apply this to emotional pain or life as a whole? I will say don't seek out the pain, but if the pain is there, it would be one of the ways by which you might learn to manage it. And I'm not saying it's the best way, but if that is your temperament, that would be one way by which you can develop very quickly the power of concentration, the willpower, and this ability to consciously dissociate from one thing or to associate with another part of you to the exclusion of all else, etc. So if it's there, we'll do it. Emotional pain has a physical component. It can actually be registered in the biology. This is a very interesting factor, because the emotional pain, although taking place in the subtle body, in the emotional layer, still is bound to the physical, and therefore you experience this pain in the physical as a physical pain, and measurably. In the brain, they see all the symptoms of pain are seen as if it were a physical pain, but there's nothing physically. So that identification makes for this. But what is fascinating, and this is part of the whole training for the out-of-body experience, if you were to go out of the body and experience the same thing there, you would experience it 1,000 times more intense. So the question is more complex, and I think this is a point I would like to conclude for today, is regarding the dangers, because so much has been asked about dangers, and we will still explore that in detail, in depth with Geminus. But what are the kinds of dangers? Geminus made this observation in some correspondence we had. He said, going out of the body is less dangerous than walking on the street traffic in India. But the dangers are not physical there, the dangers are psychological. And some examples, and he will share that more thoroughly with us. But one of the things which could happen, for example, is you find surges of desires, emotions, temptations. You enter a space which is full of a certain grade of consciousness, because you will tend to go into domains which correspond to what dominates in you. You'll find a wave of fear suddenly thrown at you, a wave of anger or hatred or passion. Marx speaks about this, he calls it the swamp region, where all the vital forces, particularly the lower vital domains, and he says everyone has to pass through that. Eventually you learn to kind of pass through, but eventually you will face it. When you do, what do you do? And when it hits you 1,000 times more intensely, because everything is more intense, the ability to deal with that is the ability you will have learnt while in the body, where it is dimmed by 1,000 times. So what do you do when you have a surge of anger within you? If here you have learnt to be able to deal with it, out of body you'll find you can deal with it, because it's the same skill, the same ability, the same poise of consciousness. And Marx's observation, you can try to fight it, it is infinite. It overwhelms you. The only thing you can do is to be totally equal to it. He describes this in his book. So that basic capacity to build equality here, if you have done it here, this will give you the ability to deal with that. So in a sense, the two are mutually interdependent, and experience there of a higher grade will be useful for influencing your outer nature and preparing it and in the influence. And equally, experiences here and self-control and mastery you develop here would be then your capacity to deal with things of those worlds, including the discussion we had with Mark, and I highlighted that last time, when he said you should be able to go to the level where that person is. What determines if you can go to that level? Well, the level at which you live. So if in daily life, in your embodied consciousness, you have learned consciously to shift levels, and you have built links, continuities across these levels, then out of body you can shift levels and wander through in a continuity across worlds and so on. So experience, or let's say self-control and skill developed here would be an aid there. Experiences deepened and intensified there would be an aid here. And so this would be the deeper understanding of the utility of this line of experience. So to come back to Amelia's question, can you apply this to emotional pain, life as a whole? Yes, but in what way? From a spiritual point of view. Not merely by a stoic separation, but also by First disengaging and then turning around to be able to act on it by some deeper or higher principle, power, truth, or experience, by which you can even change or heal or bring a new habit, new rhythm, recast, reshape, transform, and so on. So, Marine says, when I started doing the descent of the piece, the quality of my OBE changed. Yes, I'm very happy to hear that. Much more, you will develop the ability to consciously shift between gradations of layers. And if you work on that consciously here while in the embodied state, you will have that ability there also to be able to shift between gradations and worlds, go into specific domains, and so on. The mother describes this. We will come to this passage later on. But there was a specific location in those worlds where the secret of life was kept for her, waiting for her, and would only be revealed to her. It had her name on it. So how that works, we will discuss in possibly in the next session. I think that's all for today. I'm a little, I'm not sure how useful this is for all of you. I'm hoping it is going to be useful. So do leave some comments indicating that you would like, if you would like this topic to continue, or if you think it's already too much because we've already had 11 sessions. Today is the 11th. I do believe we can have easily 2 more if we take these texts of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo. I personally find them very enriching and very valuable, sometimes nuanced observations, but which have implications in the practice. So from your comments, perhaps I will take that as an indication, and we will continue this topic next time. For the moment then, let's take it in the spirit and the conclusion of this. Remember Mother's advice, what she has said to be so important. The ability to observe and distinguish between gradations of consciousness in us, to be able to consciously shift between them and to build links between them, something which we will look at a little later. But this is, like she said, the beginning of the thread. Without that, you have only chaos. And then you extend that to what Sri Aurobindo described, the necessity to become conscious on the deeper inner layers, without which you do not have instrumentation for your own psychic being to be able to act and live its spiritual life, without which you would not feel or be aware of the spiritual descent that takes place, which always takes place in the subtle body first, and from there comes out on the surface to your gross body. To be able to experience that, but also draw upon that or direct it to specific parts for healing, for change, for transformation, whatever it is, would require you to become more conscious in these deeper layers. So let's make this a conscious part of our effort by whatever method you use. Make an effort to deliberately interiorize, disengaging from the surface identification with the body and its senses. Allow the consciousness within to be independent of this, stay in it, and even allow its internal perception to gradually unfold. And this will prepare us for a much more rich and complete spiritual life and the mastery, control and mastery of our own consciousness. Let's take this as an aspiration and our focus in the coming week. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you.